Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Prescription for Change Radio. My name is Dr. Kendall Ward, and I'm here with my co-host, Dr. Philip Toll from Aspire Health Partners. And we're so lucky today to have Mr. Peter Watts from Solutionize here to talk to us a little bit about his own experiences with his son's struggle with addiction. So, Peter, welcome. Thank you for joining us. So to get started, why don't you tell us just a little bit about your experiences that you had with your son?
Certainly would. Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk with you both and the audience today. And I'm going to try and bring a message of hope to say that recovery is possible, and it does happen. And we've got some great examples of recovery in the field that we work in. We see many people that have aspired to improve, to use a term for you, Philip. And we see many great examples. And I think the examples of recovery, good recovery, need to be exemplified a bit more than they are, because it isn't a one-way journey. So I think that's true for both the individual involved and their families. So there's recovery on both sides of the equation. So my background, my son's 34. He's been dealing with addiction had been dealing with addiction for 8 years. Became involved in opioids through a serious industrial injury. And he was overprescribed for a number of years. And the problem he ran into crept up on him, and it was never very visible to the family and the doctors who we were close to. Really gave us no advice about the risks of addiction. And he was injured. He was at home for about 8 months with his injury, and during that time became very addicted, and he was socially distanced, as is happening today. So he lost a lot of things during that period of time. And over the next 5 years, he continually ran into minor offences with the police, being caught in possession quite regularly, always minor enough to get through to the next court appearance, never quite bad enough to be taken into treatment. It took about 5 years before there was sort of a court mandate. And I lost count of how many times I went to court with him. And they were all signs, and we had no one to really walk us through and tell us about the signs. In that time, he had 2 different girlfriends over the 5 years, and there was a lot of codependencies with the girlfriends. And one thing that was, looking back, one of the biggest issues that happened to my son was he started to take charge of the lives of the girlfriends and try to become the doctor for them at his own expense. And I saw the real impacts of codependency. It made him feel good looking after his girlfriends. It was about the only thing that made him feel good, I think, in his life once he got into addiction. So about 3 years ago, he was court mandated to go into a treatment program, just like you have in Seminole County. They didn't have early intervention with him, but when the judge finally came to terms with his record, they said you have a mandatory 6 months. And he served in a New Jersey treatment center and came out from the treatment center without any guidelines or guidance or next steps, and immediately relapsed and spent the next year dealing with isolation. We live in a quite isolated area in New York. Didn't have a job for a period of time, lived with his parents. He's 34, he was 32 at the time, not the best thing for a 32-year-old. So a number of compound issues. And then thanks to a number of factors, particularly a job and a good support system and a few good peers that helped him, he saw the light, and he's been clean for about a year, and he's pretty much back to where he was, but with many years of his life lost. So the good news, I know you've dealt with some people today that have lost children, and I don't know how really to address that discussion, but we're on the hope side of it. And certainly some of the things, some of my thoughts and recollections designed to try and help people understand what to do a little bit better, because I was certainly a virgin when I got into this. I didn't know a single thing about the acronyms. I didn't understand the difference between treatment and recovery. And I think that gap was huge, and it takes a long time to learn. And the time it took me to learn was probably the most difficult time for my son. So you need this sort of fast track learning process at the beginning in order to really provide a support system. So some of what I wanted to talk about today, stem from that. So that's pretty much how I got there. That's the beginning of the journey. And I'm pleased to say we've always had a very good relationship with my son. He had a good education. He's an entertainer, and he's a very happy person, always has been. And the real good news in this is that you can get back to where you were. And I think not enough people understand that about addiction. And that's, since I'm involved in recovery, both personally and professionally in my work. So I'm able to see a lot of value from all the work that's done in recovery. And if I can tell people more about the positive issues in recovery, the happier I will be.
Peter, you're making some incredibly important points that I'm sure many in our listening audience are resonating with. Number one is you had no idea what to do. You know there's signs, but you couldn't pick them up because you didn't have any experience with substance use disorders, and may have gone on for a longer period of time because you didn't have the knowledge that you needed. And that must be a very frightening experience, and I'm sure many of our listeners have that level of fear. It's scary to try to maneuver the waters of substance use disorder, particularly when it's loved ones that are using, and you love them and you fear for their safety and for their very life. From a parent perspective or a loved one perspective, what might you suggest? I heard you say a real fast education process, and you thrown in it's kind of like thrown in the deep end of the pool and learn to swim. Any suggestions? Because taking away that fear could be very helpful in helping loved ones be that support that you're talking about.
Certainly, but it's a multi-dimensional problem. So I sort of broke down some recommendation into 4 areas. So things you have to understand, things that you must do, things you must learn, and things you must be prepared to do. So that was really my segments of it, and I'm going to refer to my notes. So let me start with the understanding piece of it. I think one of the hard things to understand is that this issue isn't about you as the parent or the family. It's I remember standing in line at Rikers Island. My son had disappeared. My business partner had got back from an overseas trip. I met her at the airport. My wife called to say, her son's missing. We think he's in incarceration somewhere. And he was on the bad end of it in New York City and ended up at Rikers Island, which is a place to be destroyed in the next few years. It's an awful place. I was standing in line at 7 o'clock on a Saturday morning with a lot of mainly young women, many of them with children, many unmarried, coming to see their men in the prison. And it would be easy to stand in line in a place like that and think, woe is me. And actually, it's not about me. And I think the more people understand it, you can't feel bad about yourself in these circumstances. So number one is understand it's not about you. Secondly, I said to Dr. Kendall earlier that substance use is one of the unique chronic diseases, and we deal with people with chronic diseases in my professional life. In other chronic diseases, you don't get assaulted, you don't get robbed, you don't deal with trauma, you don't have property damage, all the things that happen to families quite often with addiction. Not everyone, but many do. And it's easy when you're dealing with that to feel bad yourself. In fact, it's natural to feel better about yourself. But I think it's such an unusual disease, and you have to keep remembering it's a disease. And the thing I've learned working with the professionals that this is a chronic disease. And so that's the second thing I think you have to understand. The third thing is that addiction doesn't change the underlying person, and they can still be what they were previously. And many people think there's sort of a moral decay or a behavioral decay or a mental decay in people. I've seen a lot of recovery where people actually go on to do really good after going through serious addiction issues. You have to sort of really understand that they're just in a fog, the same as people dealing with chemotherapy. It's it's a chemical distraction in your life, distraction being a sort of understatement. The next point is that relapse happens. And I've learned from quite a few professionals that you have to accept relapse, not just be sidetracked by it, but understand that it's going to happen, and your goal is to try and reduce the time between, increase the time between relapses. That was a really hard thing for my wife and I to deal with, but both quite differently. I used to tell her what I was hearing professionally, that relapses happen, and she couldn't quite accept that. So I think it's very important for people to understand and know that it's part of your job to try and help increase that gap. Just like you try and help people with cancer, for example, get more exercise or eat properly. It's a similar sort of responsibility, I think. The other thing to understand is the codependencies that I run into, that codependencies are bad. They do create collective behavior, which is tougher to deal with. And the other thing my wife asked me to bring up today I said to her, if there's one takeaway, what would be important for you to understand? And she said, trust your gut. There's no coincidences in people dealing with addiction. They're trying to work through getting solutions, and there aren't any solutions. So they tend to evade and avoid and cheat at times to get what they need. And if you think something smells bad, it usually is. And you have to sort of recognize it for what it is rather than let your heart judge. So I think they were the main things about understanding. So that's sort of section one of what I wanted to cover, because they're the things that we didn't understand. And it took us a long time and a critical time in during his illness. The first months are critical, unlike muscle injuries and soccer injuries and things. You haven't got weeks to recover, you got sometimes hours and days. And there were these gaps in our knowledge that took us a long time to understand.
Yeah, Peter, I think you bring up some amazingly good points as our listeners are thinking about their own situation and their own lives and, their own loved ones, and just having an understanding of what their loved ones are going through can be so important and can really make such a difference in how they treat their loved ones, to understand that this is a disease, that this is not a moral failing. This is a medical condition that affects your brain chemistry, and that you still love this person, even though they may be doing things that they would not normally do. Yeah.
An important point there, Peter, is the family in recovery as well. Good treatment really needs to require the individual who's living with the substance use disorder and the family that they're supporting that individual.
Right.
Interesting that you made that I think is really key and poignant is not to take it personally. Any recommendations or guides for family members out there? Because it's hard not to take it personally. It's lie, steal, cheat. You stole grandma's brooch and you pawned it. Never to be seen again. Those are the kinds of things. You didn't pay the mortgage. The house is being foreclosed on. Those kinds of things that really are very hard not to take personally.
Absolutely.
Any words of advice there?
You have a number of things happen to you that my son, for example, fought with me a few times. He certainly embezzled things from me. He stole a lot of valuable assets that we had, like keepsakes and things from family members that you can't get back. It's certainly tough not to take those personally, but you have to just keep in mind, you have to look past where you're at, and you have to sort of look backwards and forwards at the same time. You have to look at what the person is and what joy they brought to your life, and you got to get them back to that point again. So you tend to have to not look at the moment, and that, I think that's the hardest thing, and particularly when you've got warring family members, with different points of view. So one of the things that onto my next list was about what you must do, and the first thing on the must do is take charge. Somebody has to take charge in the family. This is not a passive disease. This isn't sit back and let the oncologist fix the cancer problem. It's you need to be on par with the professionals and the others that are helping, and you need to be engaged in the process. So for example, a real irony happened to me. We were working with a treatment center in our professional life, in my professional life. At the same time, my son went to that treatment center, excuse me, and he left the treatment center with no transition plan, no follow-up, no actions, no next steps, no connections. And I passively allowed that to happen. And no, I don't want to be aggressive about it, but one of the things I think somebody in the family needs to do is to take charge and deal with the transitions and be involved in listening carefully to people about what their guidance is, and look at the totality of care. You know, that's what we tried to do. I don't think we did a good job on it. I don't think we took charge, because there's always a belief that your son or daughter can make decisions, and they mean well. And the fact is they can't make good decisions when they're in the middle of addiction, and they don't mean well because they're not thinking well. They're thinking need, you know. So to take charge of the journey was a really important thing for me. And then I think understanding that you know, it's a disease that a village needs to help. This isn't just one person. And one of the things that I found most interesting, like many people, you're hesitant about the criminal justice system because it usually means bad things. You're generally not involved with them for good things. I earned a great deal of respect. I learned a great deal of respect, created respect from the criminal justice system, because the judge who suggested my son needs to go into care, some of the police officers that stopped him on occasions actually were trying to point him in the right direction. I was talking to him about this before I met with you guys. Not all, but a large majority of the people were actually helpful, and they were trying to get him to change and trying to see, you know, the errors of his ways, and they were quite helpful during the process. So I had a great deal of regard. And recently we spoke with the Seminole County Sheriff's Department, and I was cognizant of a few other departments we work with in Jersey and in Indiana, and the sheriff's departments are actually really supportive to the programs that are around today, and they're an integral part of the care. And I think one thing families have to do is to actually embrace the criminal justice, which is sort of anti-ethical, or it's not always logical for people to think I'm going to embrace the criminal justice system, but you do have to work with it. And I think its intentions increasingly are good. Yeah. The third, I guess the third is similar to the first one, take charge. You can't be passive. You can't be overbearing, but you have to understand what's going on, and you have to take the time to understand what's going on and not allow other people to distract you from it. So my wife, for example, is less aggressive than me. And she's a very kind soul, helps anybody, and she always is looking for the nicer solution. And I'd often look to get more involved. And you need that push and pull, I think, to understand the reality of what you're dealing with. That we're the decision makers, and the professionals like yourself, Dr. Philip, you play a role. You're a spoke in it, but you're not the hub. You know, and I think that was the thing we learned, that the hub is the village. It's the totality of everyone that's important.
And I think that, you know, that's a great point. And that's really one of our goals with this radio show, and with what Project Opioid is doing around the state of Florida, is recognizing that it takes a community to address this issue. And it takes a village to fix the system of care. And, you know, to speak to the immediacy and the need to take charge. I mean, Phil, can you give us, you know, tell us about how loved ones can reach out to Aspire again? Those people that, you know, are ready to take charge of their loved ones and ready to help, just as Peter was talking about, what can they do?
Well, clearly, as Peter's indicating, education and having the knowledge that what to do next, where to reach out to.
Right.
So family members can reach out to Aspire Health Partners, you know, wives, husbands, brothers, sisters, for guidance and education, particularly with the Marchman order, that we can guide them through that process and support them, because not everybody's ready for treatment on their own, even though there may be a life-threatening situation going on. So the taking charge piece is really key. Moving in that direction of saying, educate me, help me. I want to be a part of this process. The important point that you're making, Peter, which is one that I want to make sure we emphasize over and over and over again, is that person before, they're the person before substance use. They are still that person, and they have a disease process that's acting on, you know, their behavior, on their feelings, on their actions. And so getting that education, getting that help, at Aspire Health Partners, we, particularly even with telehealth, you could be in another part of the country and we can do family therapy with you.
Right.
You know, so parents living in Washington State, we can do therapy and reconnect them and educate them. In our residential programs, we require family education. So before you can see your loved one for the first time in residential treatment, you must come to family education, family therapy without your loved one,
Right.
not the one in treatment, so that you can learn about the disease of addiction, as well as to deal with your own issues, so that you
Right.
can work through, you know, not taking it personally, and to be that support.
Right. And I think the family aspect and the community aspect is so important, and just understanding that there are resources available, and that there are people in your community and in your families that love you and want what's best for you. And oftentimes that does mean treatment and hard decisions. And as Peter mentioned, somebody that's going to take charge and really push your recovery forward. Yeah.
Important point you made too, Peter, is that division within the family members.
Right.
Because you may, you know, in your case, it may have, you know, your wife may have been a little bit less aggressive than you are, but you may have other adult children who differ. The spouse may be having different ideas and thoughts. So you end up battling one another sometimes. And what's the best approach?
Right.
You know, or don't push it, don't marching order them, don't force them into treatment. They, you know, so those things can be very difficult family struggles to address.
Absolutely.
They certainly divide, a bit like divorces, I think, really, because you've got a philosophical divorce in some cases. And my younger son was the one that really helped me the most. I used to speak to him probably every day, and I used to walk around supermarkets with my headphones on, gesticulating, talking with him about the latest problem. He was great. He was bedrock for me. And you have to find, I have a doctor on the advisory board of my business, and he always says, you got to find Uncle Louie. You got to have Uncle Louie that can explain the problem to you and interpret. And in any group, I think finding Uncle Louie is sort of a key. You know, get the right leader in the group. The things I learned that I'd encourage everyone to learn, I got like 4 points. First, understand the underlying condition. So my son's, in his case, was an injury, and a bad injury, and he had a lot of pain from it. So medically assisted treatment, once I understood what it was, made a great deal of sense. Some people with social issues don't have those pain issues. So most families don't understand MAT, and I didn't understand his condition. And the second point, I didn't understand the language of addiction. So I didn't know the difference between MAT, IOP, treatment and recovery, and all the acronyms that you use. So when we tried to look for help, we didn't even know what letter to begin with for help. So learn the language real fast. And I think if we can do anything collectively to give, you know, a 101 guide to language of it, it's so important. I've been involved with MAT now for the last 3 or 4 years. I used to take my son to the methadone clinic every day, and it was one of the most depressing things I ever did, just continuing to go there every day. My wife and I shared the burden, but it was a huge problem. And then we learned about Suboxone, then we got involved with Vivitrol, and you see these different aspects of MAT, and it was so important. And there was a really interesting, very pivotal point for me about the need to learn. The day that my son was had to go to court for the final judgment, you know, the showdown day, you know, your 4 weeks are up. Are you in a program or not? And the judge said, if you're not in a program, I'm going to put you in jail. And that morning, I wanted my son to go to court that afternoon with me. My wife wanted whatever he wanted as the answer, and he chose to go to emergency room, get detoxed, so he could get into a non-MAT program, because he couldn't get into an MAT program because they weren't available. And I tell you that those few hours that morning, and then my need to go to court without my son to face the judge, with his probation officer and his lawyer and everyone there except him. And I had to explain to the judge that he chose a route that would be better for his health than the route you've chosen. And it was only because I was educated enough by that time that I was able to be an advocate for him, really, or represent his point of view. And it was a real pivotal, real session. And the one thing that was really important that day too, that you have to learn about, is peer recovery help. So that particular morning, I was actually in a treatment center, helping them with some of our business. And I kept getting calls from my family, my wife and my lawyer and my son, saying, what's going to happen this afternoon? And one of the ladies in the treatment center pointed to this young man. When she knew the problem I was dealing with, she said, this young man can help you. And I turned around, there was a 25-year-old skinny little young kid who was a peer support counselor. And he looked like modern man, and I don't. And we were like worlds apart. This guy at 11 o'clock was told to go to court with me at 2 o'clock and help me. And there was me in my 60s. There was my lawyer in his 50s, my probation officer in their 40s. The judge ignored all of us. And he basically said, you guys, you haven't solved the problem. And he turned to the peer guy and said, will you look after him? Will you make sure he gets into a program? Will you make sure he comes out and goes into a program? Will you look out for him for the next 12 months? And when he said yes, then the judge made a call. So the village, the peer piece of the village, was to me really important. And we've worked with a lot of peers since. And I think their job is invaluable. And they know, well, the bodies are buried. And I hate to use that term, but it's a true one. You know, many of them have lost a lot of friends through addiction. And their goal is to help other people. And I think they're a pivotal part.
I agree. And I think, Peter, you bring up an excellent point about, we do have there's so much jargon in this industry, and I'm guilty of it myself. And we try to avoid the acronyms and the medical terms and everything. But if you want to be an advocate for someone in your family or even your friend circle who's suffering, learning those terms and learning what MAT is and learning the different kinds of medications that can be taken can be very empowering. And it's not that hard. It's just a matter of being exposed to it in so many ways. And I think, Peter, you bring up just an amazing point of educating yourself so that you can be that advocate.
You know, we work with we work in the world of cancer, and there's a famous Olympic athlete we work with who's the head of the foundation, and he's dealt with cancer himself for many years. And he said, if you go see a hematologist, the problem's blood. If you go see a radiologist, problems about the radiology test you're going to have. And I think addiction is very much the same. You know, there's a lot of religion about MAT. In some cases, there's a lot of philosophy about the wisdom of it. There's stories about, you know, if you take Vivitrol once, you'll forget to take it next month. If you go to methadone clinic every day, this sort of dependency on going every day. And I think you have to go learn about that as a parent to understand what decisions you're allowing to happen. Certainly, that was a big thing for me, and the relief of understanding it. It took me a while.
What's the best way for a parent to learn? I mean, if I'm talking to a parent right now, one of our listeners, like how do they learn? How do they get those resources?
Well, definitely reaching out to get their own help.
Right.
Even when your loved one may not be ready for treatment, to reach out for yourself, because as Pete points out, the family's in recovery as well.
Right.
So even do it for yourself. Some self-help groups like Al-Anon and Nar-Anon can be helpful for family members to get some of that education. Clearly, we have the websites, you know, Aspire's website, Project Opioid's website, and give some real information. When you talk about MAT, medication-assisted treatment, you know, you're frightened already. You're terrified that your loved one is going to die from an overdose. And so it's difficult waters to maneuver when you're fearful, you know, when you're hurt, when you're angry, and then when you don't know, you know, like it's the ignorance that we have, which is just lack of education to educate ourselves. But that's information. Who wants to have that information?
Right.
You know, in our scheme of our overall lives, we don't want to be knowledgeable about substance use disorders, and yet we need to be when our loved ones are suffering. And so that's key. And it's also key on the part of us professionals to take that time with family, to spend that time to say, let me explain how things work. Let me educate you about how medication-assisted treatment really can be helpful and really is necessary when we talk about opioid dependency. And so And the web,
Right.
The World Wide Web, is always a great place for some good education.
Absolutely.
And I would say, like to Peter's point, come equipped with questions. Ask the professionals, ask the treatment centers. What does this really mean? What can I expect? How do I help them cope with their relapse?
I think one thing that was important to me, there's a lot of dogma involved in it, and there's religious dogma as well as sort of philosophical and medical dogma in it. And I think the thing that I love about Project Opioid and the initiative itself is being that sort of neutral party to synthesize and get trusted information, because I actually got a lot of conflicting information, and it was very, very complicated. And I got a lot of conflicting information from my son. So it was what his personal preference was that suited him at the time, which wasn't the best course of action necessarily. So I think the trusted source and the fact this coalition you guys have got, I think is brilliant, because you can synthesize the answers for everyone. So in terms of learning, that to me was probably the most important thing to learn. And then listen carefully to what you're saying and what others are saying and what the individuals are saying. That's sort of obvious, but you really have to listen carefully to it as a parent. And the thing I learned that was probably the most valuable for me, but personally and professionally, and certainly for the benefit of my son, the recovery has got these sort of 4 well-defined pillars under SAMHSA. You've got home, health, community, purpose. And if you get the home situation right, being homeless isn't a great formula for recovery. Having bad medical underlying conditions isn't good for recovery. Not having a community around you is not good for recovery. Not having purpose, I think I've seen that as the biggest one. When my son's got a job, works in a landscaping organization, and the fact that they love him, pay him regularly, want him there, they want him to work 6-7 days a week. He does it with a passion, and takes photographs of what he's doing in the place and sends it to the family, because it's a sign that someone else loves him. It's not just us, it's his employer, And I think that purpose, we've seen it. We've been to a few jails. We've been seeing other recovery programs. We've been to NA meetings, AA meetings. And I think universally, purpose is, the others are sort of given. You have to have home, you have to have health, you have to have community. But the purpose to me is the clincher. I think, I personally believe purpose enables sustained recovery. The others help recovery. I think the purpose is sustaining it. So they were sort of the learning aspects. And I've nearly finished my list. I hope I'm doing okay on time. But
you're doing great.
Right.
Yeah, this is perfect.
So the next section I had was on that learning. I have to say that I've been lucky enough to work with quite a few different professionals, and I've had so many different opinions at so many times. And I think back to being prepared and be invested in the process, you have to take time to understand all the vagaries of it, and your opinions change over time. And I think my wife, for example, now is so supportive of recovery, and because she now actually understands what it means. She didn't know at the time. She didn't know the difference between treatment and recovery. So I got a list of a few things to be prepared for, and I think they were really important for me. You have to maintain advocacy in the family. Someone has to be strong enough to maintain that advocacy and not let the confusion impact the individual, because it does happen. I've seen many families fight over issues, and then the poor person dealing with addiction is the one without a say in it. They're often treated as an object, not the subject, and that's a problem. You also have to be, so number one, prepared to maintain that advocacy, and I think number two was to be prepared to invade privacy, and I know that doesn't sit well with many people, but you have to go and find where the people's drugs are, and you have to go find what they're really doing with their time when appropriate. You have to find the right time to do it. But had we not invaded our son's privacy, he wouldn't be alive today. I'm so convinced of it. And we've both turned into super snoops, and it's something that you have to be prepared to do. And I think I said also you have to be prepared to regress. I'm doing things now. I'm driving my 34-year-old son around because he lost his license still. And I take him to meetings, I take him to work, and my wife does the same. And you have to be prepared to go back and think, it's okay. You know, it's okay driving a 34-year-old to work. It's part of the process. And I think that was, I've had a number of people say, why do you do that? Why? Well, because there's no choice, number one. And number two, it's the right thing to do. And it creates the right bond, I think. It lets you know you're involved in that. Lets my son know that we're involved in that recovery. So that actually was really important to me. I used to resent it initially because I kept thinking, just get your license back, you know, get back to your life. But it's not that easy. Thousands of dollars in fines and so on. So there's some practical issues with this disease that many people don't understand. And the final thing about being prepared, you have to be prepared. I said it before, you have to be prepared to look backwards to what people were and look forward to where they're going to be and look forward to those happy times again. Because if you don't do that, you do create that stigma. You know, when you know, stigma's the killer for many people, and it sort of impacts their self-worth. And if you're looking forward to happier time, if you can look forward to happier times, you're going to do a much better job on it. And I was just prompted to talk about the final thought on this was about the language and how you talk about recovery. And we've learned dealing with a lot. I didn't learn it as a parent. I learned it in my professional life, but to work with people like you, Dr. Foote, to understand the language to use with people, to talk about their addiction issues and what are good words and what are bad words to use, so it doesn't prompt them to feel hopeless and worthless and useless again, you know. And I think that's the sort of hardest thing for me, to see my son, who was bright and very capable and very, he's a really good communicator. He's a musician and communicated with public audiences, big ones, without any problem. But to see him sort of shrink into that cell, shrink into his shell and sort of regress is very hard to deal with. And, you know, you've got to get the words right to come out of it, because the minute you start to insult and the minute you start to degrade, you're prolonging the problem, you know.
Peter, what you're saying is so critical for our listeners to hear today, which is that getting involved, you know, you talk about the lived experience of the peer, you're really a parent peer. You know, it's really important that people like yourself and your wife are out there speaking about opioid addiction, what it really means. It takes the stigma away, it takes the shame away, it takes the guilt away, to say that this can happen to any of us. And it really is that disease that Dr. Ward keeps talking about. It's a disease. Someone needs a ride to chemotherapy or to radiation, we're going to give it. Why do we hesitate to do that when they need a ride because they lost their license because of a substance use disorder? We don't punish cancer survivors. We don't punish those with diabetes. And to your point, the language that we use, it's not judgment, it's not punishment. It's about, we're going to help you manage your disease effectively. And so whatever support system we need in place, which is key for family and others to understand, is really essential.
Right. I don't think we can underestimate or overstate how important the family is in the recovery process, and especially long term. And you're so right. I mean, I know I've reiterated this point, but it is a disease. And if you are listening to this right now and you feel like we're speaking to you or we're speaking to you about your child, you know, it's so important that you reach out for help. And you can reach out to Aspire Health Partners. You can go to the Project Opioid website and find information. There's so many places that you can find resources to learn about this, because there is a huge learning curve. Let's be honest. Yes. This is a very clinical field, but you don't have to be an expert, and it doesn't have to cost a ton of money. You just need to reach out and break your isolation and get the help that you need for yourself and for your child.
One of the things I found to be really an interesting sort of dichotomy was the with comorbidities and co-occurring conditions, particularly the comorbidities, when you've got a physical injury or two, and you're masking it with you have addiction issues too. We had a very interesting example. June 2 years ago, I was working with a hospital and a treatment center in New Jersey. And in 1 month, the hospital referred 105 patients to the treatment center. 60 of them were overdoses, 45 were medical conditions that were hidden by the addiction, or the other way around, I can't remember actually. But the ER's advice was, you need to go to an addiction center, treatment center. And I think the great thing about the coalitions that you guys are building is if you can bring those medical and behavioral skills together. I think there's a huge gap there. And I read somewhere that there was $47 billion, $470 billion lost in 2017 from delayed or misdiagnosis between medical and behavioral health. And it's sort of stunning. It's stunning. And I think the two things are so different. And what we have, my son got checked into a treatment center in a really rough part of New Jersey. And he had some he had back problems and foot problems, and he needed painkillers. And they wouldn't give him any painkillers at the weekend because there weren't support staff on at the weekend. And he was in so much pain, he checked out on a Saturday night. And I remember it so clearly, picking him up at midnight in the middle of the drug trade in New Jersey, in absolute misery. And he could not stand the pain. So I had to take an ER to get some medical help. And I think if anything I could encourage between the professionals of collaboration between the professionals, there's so many gaps there.
Right. And this goes back to what we've been talking about so much, is the importance of the entire community coming together to work around this issue. This is not an isolated issue. This is something that affects all aspects of our community, our business leaders, our faith, our community support. Everybody has to come together to really support people who are struggling and offer them the care that they need. So, well, I would really like to thank you, Peter, for joining us today and giving us just amazing insights into what you can do as a parent of someone who is struggling. And it's been wonderful to hear your points and your firsthand experiences. And I really appreciate you being with us. Now, Phil, if there is someone listening to us today, again, one more time, if there's somebody that's listening to us today who feels like they're in Peter's situation, who they have a friend, a loved one, a child who's suffering, what do they do? Who do they call?
Definitely call Aspire Health Partners at 407-875-3700. Hit 3 on the auto attendant, take you directly to our access center. That piece, and also our website of aspirehealthpartners.com can give you the information that you need. I want to say thank you, Peter, and thank you to your son for his willingness to let you share his story and your story. It's key, that you support him and that you're an advocate, as you say, for those who are living with substance use disorder.
It is. And you started this whole segment off by talking about this is a message of hope. And I think that we can all carry that and bring that home, that this is a message of hope. You don't have to end in a statistic. If you're suffering, you don't have to overdose. You don't have to die. You can reach out. There's supports available. There's resources available. There's hope for your children, there's hope for yourself. And so I think that's such an important message that can so often get lost. So thank you so much, Peter, for sharing that with us. And thank you so much, everyone, for listening to Prescription for Change Radio. Again, I'm Dr. Kendall Ward, and I'm here with Dr. Phil Toll from Aspire Health Partners. And we hope we'll listen to you next time.